The Boeing 737 shuddered through turbulence at 37,000 feet, its passengers blissfully unaware that in 12 minutes, their routine commercial flight would become the opening move in an international crisis. Lieutenant Colonel Raven Blackhorse sat in seat 11C, her weathered hands folded over a dog-eared paperback, trying to forget the taste of her last deployment. The retirement papers in her carry-on felt heavier than the Medal of Honor gathering dust in her apartment drawer. She'd earned her call sign, Ghost Walk, 15 years ago over the skis of Afghanistan, where she'd piloted A-10 Thunderbolts through valleys that swallowed lesser pilots whole. Now, at 42, the Air Force had deemed her administratively valuable, a polite way of saying too old for the cockpit, too experienced to waste on a desk. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was flying as a passenger for the first time in 2 decades. The businessman in 11B kept glancing at her service ribbons, probably wondering why a decorated officer was flying coach to Seattle. He had no idea that the quiet woman beside him had once held off 3 MiG-29s with a damaged aircraft and a prayer, or that her tactical innovations were still taught at the Air Force Academy. To him, she was just another middle-aged woman reading a thriller novel. Then the radio crackled. It wasn't the usual pilot-to-tower chatter. This was military frequency, encrypted, urgent, bleeding through the aircraft's communication system like blood through bandages. Raven's head snapped up, her pilot instinct screaming danger before her conscious mind could process the words. Mayday, Mayday, this is Condor Flight 447. We are declaring emergency. Unknown aircraft have entered restricted airspace over Joint Base Lewis McChord. Repeat, we have multiple bogies, origin unknown, intent hostile. All civilian aircraft are advised. Static consumed the transmission. The 737's captain, a tired-looking man named Peterson according to the manifest she'd memorized out of habit, came over the intercom with practiced calm. Folks, we're experiencing some minor communication difficulties. Nothing to worry about, just going to adjust our flight path slightly. But Raven could hear it in his voice, the barely contained panic that came with flying blind into the unknown. She unbuckled her seatbelt and started moving toward the cockpit, ignoring the confused protests from other passengers. Her fingers found the military ID in her pocket, muscle memory from 1,000 briefings, where identification meant the difference between friend and foe. The flight attendant tried to stop her, but Raven's expression, cold, focused, utterly serious, made the young woman step aside. Something was happening down there, something that required more than commercial aviation protocols and passenger comfort announcements. Something that required Ghost Walk. The radio burst to life again, clearer this time, and every passenger heard the words that would change their flight from routine to legend. Identify any combat officers on board. We need military personnel immediately. This is not a drill. Raven's war wasn't over after all. It was just beginning at 37,000 feet, and she was the only weapon in an aluminum tube full of civilians. The sky ahead looked deceptively peaceful, but she knew better. Storms always started with clear skies. Every nerve in her body was singing the old song, the one that said death was coming, and only the prepared would survive. As she approached the cockpit door, her reflection in the window showed not a retiring officer, but a predator who'd been sleeping too long. The businessman in 11B would later tell reporters he'd never seen anyone move with such quiet, deadly purpose. The intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to land immediately at Joint Base Lewis McChord. Military personnel are requested to identify themselves to the flight crew. Raven knocked on the cockpit door, her knuckles steady against the metal. When it opened, she didn't wait for questions. Lieutenant Colonel Raven Blackhorse, call sign Ghost Walk, tactical fighter pilot, 15 years active combat. She held up her ID. I'm guessing you need someone who speaks their language. Captain Peterson's relief was visible. Thank God. We've got fighters scrambling all around us, and nobody's telling us what's happening. The tower keeps asking if we have military aboard. Through the cockpit windows, Raven could see them now distant specks against the clouds that her trained eye recognized as F-22 Raptors in combat formation. They weren't escorting the commercial flight. They were hunting something else. Something that had turned the peaceful Pacific Northwest into a potential battlefield. "How long have you been out of the cockpit?" Peterson asked, gesturing toward the co-pilot's empty seat. His regular co-pilot had called in sick that morning, another coincidence in a day full of them. 6 months, Raven said, settling into the familiar embrace of a pilot's chair. Her hands found the controls like coming home. But some things you never forget. The radio sparked with encrypted chatter, call signs and coordinates that painted a picture of controlled chaos below. Multiple unknown aircraft, stealth characteristics, presumed hostile. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than a simple airspace violation. "Ghostwalk, this is Olympus Control," came a voice she recognized, Colonel Marcus Webb, her former squadron commander. "We show you aboard civilian Flight 2847. Confirm your status." She keyed the mic. "Olympus Control, Ghostwalk confirms. Aboard commercial aircraft, approximately 40 souls. What's the situation?" "Classified. Can you assist with tactical assessment from your position?" Raven looked out at the sky that had been her domain for so long. Somewhere out there, pilots younger than her were facing an unknown enemy. Her retirement could wait. The war had found her at 37,000 feet, in Seat 11C of a Boeing 737, and she was about to remind everyone why they called her Ghostwalk. The sky was about to remember its most dangerous daughter. "Olympus Control, Ghostwalk is operational. Send me what you've got." The transmission that followed would turn a routine flight into the opening chapter of a story that would be told in pilot bars and classified briefings for decades to come. Lieutenant Colonel Raven Blackhorse was no longer a passenger. She was a weapon, and the sky was her battlefield once again. From his seat in 11B, the businessman watched through the gap in the cockpit door as the quiet woman transformed into something else entirely, something lethal and necessary. He would later tell his wife that he'd never felt safer in his life than when he saw those weathered hands take control of their fate. The radio chatter intensified, and Raven began to understand the scope of what they were facing. Unknown stealth aircraft, moving in coordinated formations, approaching major population centers along the West Coast. Not a drill, not an exercise. This was the real thing, and she was the only combat pilot in a civilian aircraft full of innocents. "Peterson," she said quietly, "I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" The captain looked at her service ribbons, her calm demeanor, the way she handled the radio like it was an extension of her soul. "Yes, ma'am." "Good, because we're about to become part of something much bigger than a delayed flight to Seattle." Outside, the F-22s were closing formation, and Raven could see the contrails of additional aircraft launching from bases across the region. Whatever was coming, the United States military was responding with everything they had. And somehow, impossibly, she was going to be part of it again. The sky stretched endless and blue ahead of them, beautiful and terrible in its vastness. Raven Blackhorse had thought her war was over, but war had found her in the clouds, and she was exactly where she belonged. The passengers behind her had no idea that their lives now depended on a woman they dismissed as just another face in coach. Ghostwalk was back in the sky, and the enemy had no idea what was coming for them. The radio crackled with her new orders, and Raven Blackhorse smiled for the first time in 6 months. She was a weapon again, flying toward danger with a plane full of souls depending on her expertise. Some people were born for moments like this. She was one of them. The Boeing 737 banked northwest toward the sound of distant thunder, the thunder of jet engines screaming toward war. In the back, passengers gripped their armrests and wondered what was happening. In the cockpit, Ghostwalk was coming home to the sky that had always been hers. Her war wasn't over. It had just found new rules. Through her headset, she could hear the young pilots checking in, call signs like Raz.